So now that we've finished our commands in our command handler, we're going to put that into practice using our command host component. And in this example, we're going to be adding an employee through our command that we just created in an action form. So for our employee action, I've just created a razor page again with a code behind. And this is just going to be our action that we're going to be using. It's going to inherit our CQS action component, as you can see. It's called timesheet CQS action component because it's specific to this demo. But again, this is going to be used in a more generic sense when used in different applications. We have our loading spinner component here. This is very similar to the one that was in the list page, except it's just a different graphic. It works pretty much exactly the same. In our code behind, again, we have the name of the action as well as the inheritance of the timesheet CQS action component. Like I said, this is specific to this demo, but this is going to be more generalized for different applications. And then we have our two methods. We have our override async task, which is our initialize command. So if we have a command that has data already assigned to it, such as if we're editing or setting info to a specific employee, we're going to be able to keep that information when we access the command. So we don't set that back to default or anything like that. And we have our process action. So what do we do when the user clicks on the process button, whether that's labeled add or whether it's labeled something different like continue or save? So let's start with our initialize command. What do we need? So we need, first of all, a command. So I'm going to set our command that we just created as a private member. So I'm going to call this, it's going to be a private add employee command. And I'm just going to name that command. So we have this. Let's initialize our command. So what is our command going to be? It's going to be a new command. And what do we have inside? We have our aggregate root ID and we have 3 strings as well as a long. Now, apart from the aggregate root ID, everything inside this command we want to be selected by a user. It's going to be weird if through the system they choose the aggregate root ID. It's not really something we want them to control. It's going to be something that we do on the back end. But the first name, email, last name, and job title, we want that to be selected by the user. So the only thing we really need to initialize here, because it's a brand new employee that we're going to be adding, is the aggregate root ID. We're going to set this to a gwid.uGwid. There we go. So this is our command initialized, and we're going to see a bit of a more of a complex example when we get to the set employee, but at the start, we're just going to keep this simple. And this is all we really need to do for now. We're going to have a look at the front end and see what we can add to this. So we obviously want 4 different fields or 4 different action forms that we can use here to implement this data. So I'm just going to go to my sample action form here. This is just a generic document that I can just copy and paste over my forms. So I know I'm going to need a text edit because we have 3 strings that we need to implement. So I'm just going to put this 3 times. And those are going to be our first name. It's going to be our last name. And it's going to be our email. Now, it's called localizer here. Like I said before, we work in 2 different languages, English and French. And this can take this string that we put into the localizer and it can translate it into whichever language you need. So in this demo, I've actually only got English set up, but it's going to localize the first name. So it's just going to make it more neat. It's going to have a space in between first and last name, and it's going to have the relevant capitals where needed. So we already initialized our command. So we're going to have this as the command.firstName. It's going to be bound to the command.firstName. And this class outlined here, this just allows the first name to almost hover above the box. But we're going to see that when it comes to it in the action form. This is purely just a CSS class. We're going to bind this to the last name and then this to the email. Now for our job title, as we know, the add employee command job title here, this is set to a long, and we don't want the user just to guess which long job title is set to. That's going to be a bit weird. So what we're going to do, we're going to get a drop-down list for this. So I'm just going to use my drop-down list here. And I'm going to paste this in. And we know that this is going to be a job title. It's actually, I've saved this as name inside our dictionary. And we want this to be bound to the job title ID. And the value is going to be a long, as we know. This here, this commented out line, we're going to uncomment. This allows for a nullable option to be there within your drop-down. So if we remove the select item with this long, with this nullable long here, it's just going to default to the first one on the list, whereas we don't necessarily want that. Let's put in just a little message where we can just say, let's say, please select a job title. We can just put this in. I'm normally would add this to the localizer, but for the sake of this example, I'm just going to keep it as a literal string like this. Then we need a for each item in, well, this is languages because this is the default random one that I use, but let's initialize a list here. So we want a list of job titles. Now I actually have a table within my database called job titles. So I'm going to make a new variable called job titles. And this is going to come from my entity repository where I'm just going to find all my job titles. I believe this is called job title lookup. I'm going to have no filter just because I want to retrieve all of them. So I'm just going to split this so we can use it in our front end. And we have our list of drop downs. So when we come here, we can just go to our job titles. Now we need to make sure that we are saving the value and the display, or displaying the correct display. So in this case, it's going to be our item and it's going to be our name that we want to use. We don't want to show just the long. It's going to mean nothing to the user if we just display a long to them. They're not going to be able to work out which job this is. So we're going to have the name of the job, and then we're going to bind it to the entity ID instead of the SQL ID. So this is our action form setup. This is the actual UI that we can use, and we can use this in multiple places. This is going to be a generic action form that we can call from our list. So let's go and implement it onto our list. Now, if we remember before, we just have our empty action list here, and we can change that now. We can initialize a new list. And let's have a new action definition. And what do we have here? We need an action callback. We can have a string. We can have an icon, we can have a Boolean, whether it's disabled or not, and then we can have a tooltip message, which is another string. So for our action callback, we are going to make a function that is going to, or a method that is going to call our modal, which we need to initialize up here. So what we need a private action modal components. This is what we just created, our action modal component. With the name of the form that we just created, as you can see, our top action form is add employee here. And I'm just going to name this add employee modal. So this is going to be our modal that we use. And in our method down here, we're going to have it as an async task because we want to be able to await this. And I'm just going to call it show add employee modal. Just like this. And because we don't have any parameters to set, we didn't show any parameters needed in our behind page. Obviously up here, there are no parameters. So we don't need to do that. All we need to do is show this modal. That's not correct, sorry. All we need to do is, it's going to be our add employee modal, and we need to show like this, which is our task. So our action callback, we can use this here. So it's going to be async, and then we just await our show add employee modal here. Perfect. Our display is what we want to show on the button. So in our action list, because it's a generic button, or it's a generic action that doesn't require a specific employee or a specific row in whichever example you're using, it's going to appear as a button in the top right corner of our grid that's going to just have the display text inside it. So I'm going to use a localizer here. I don't think I've actually added this to the dictionary, but I'm going to use it as an example. And we're going to have an add new employee. Is it disabled? So this is an option that you can use if you don't want to display the button for a certain reason. Maybe if you have an employee count of 50, you want this to be disabled so you're not able to add any more employees. It's another way of almost validating the data that you are processing. Our icon, we're not going to be needing it in this case because, like I said, this is going to be a button and we don't need an icon within the button. It's just going to be the display text. But we're going to come back to this when we use our set employee info. And again, our tooltip message, we don't necessarily need a tooltip here. We know what it does because it has the display on it. But for a quick action, this might be needed so you can hover over it and have a bit more information on what this does. So this will be our action callback. And before anything else, we just want to add our action model component here to the front end so we can have a little bit extra control in what this does. So we have our action item, which is our add employee. We have our reference, which is the modal that we initialized before. We have our modal title, so this is what's going to appear at the top of the modal. And we have our action button label, which is going to be the button that the user clicks in order to process this action. Speaking of which, let's go back and choose what we do when we process our action. So currently we're just returning false. This is a Boolean, it's a task of a Boolean because it allows us to control the validation. If we return false in the process action, this action or the command will not be processed. So let's just return. We want to do a process command. As you can see, we either have the option for process action, we have process command, or we can process multiple commands if we give a list of commands. In this case, we just have one command, so we're just going to process the command here. And I'm just going to make this non-async, just so this can build. But again, this can be awaitable. This process command can be awaitable async as well. So if this returns false, which it will do if there's any command validation issues, such as a required field that hasn't got any information in it, such as the first name in this example, it will return false and the command will not be sent. Otherwise, if all the validation is okay, then we can return true and the command will be sent to modify our data. So going back to our list, we can see here our action button is add, and we're going to launch our application here and see what this looks like. So like I say, it's going to be a button in the top right corner because it's a more generic button. We don't want it to be displayed on each row because it's going to be a bit strange for it to appear everywhere. Now, if I go to my employees, as you can see here, we have the button in the top right corner. Like I say, it wasn't localized, so it's just using the literal string or the display that we added. Okay, if I go here, and like I say, we added validation in our command with the required fields to our employee. So if I click add here, we're going to see that it's returned false and it's displaying those validation messages. So the first name, the last name, the email, and the job title ID, these were all the default values, or whether it's string.empty or null, and the system is not going to allow this. Let's add a new member. We're going to call him Bruce Wayne, and it's going to be batman@gmail.com. And he's going to be our level 2 programmer. Let's add him and refresh our page because we haven't implemented a refresh. Here we are. We've got Bruce Wayne up here, who's a programmer level 2, and it's automatically implemented his first name as the URL link. So we don't have to go and do that for every single one. And now we're going to move on to our set employee so we can have a little more info or edit a specific row. So going into this next example, you're going to see this approach really enhances the reusability and maintainability of our code within the Blazor applications. So this aligns really well with our modern web development best practices. You're going to see that we reuse a lot of the same code and we have a lot of the same structure within the actions. So it makes reusability a lot easier. I've got my set employee info here. I've just got the base Razor page exactly the same as the add employee before. I have an empty Razor page, or at least a nearly empty Razor page with code behind. This difference though, like I said before, we're going to need to know which employee we are editing. We don't want to edit a random employee. So let's add a parameter here. And we just want to add a GUID. We set the GUID to be the identifier in the command before. So this is going to be our employee ID, but you can also use an entity ID as well. I'm going to fetch the information for the employee. So I'm going to use my entity repository. I'm going to await it. And I'm going to find the first async, and I'm going to find it by the aggregate root ID. So it's going to be our employee reporting. And I'm going to find the first, where aggregate root ID is equal to employee ID. So it's going to find the information. It's going to find the first employee where the employee ID is equal to aggregate root ID. Now, you're going to only have one. It's very unlikely that if you generate a new ID every time, you're going to have clashing IDs or conflicting IDs for a GUID. So we also want to initialize our command. Now, as you saw in the add employee command, when we initialized that command, all we initialized was a new aggregate root ID. In this case, because we already have info present, we want to make sure that we initialize these fields as well. So it's going to be a new set employee info command. I made this outside of the video just for the sake of the demo. And I'm going to copy this information across. I've left email out of this example just for the sake of simplicity so we can see how this works. So aggregate route ID, or all these information actually inside this command that we're initializing, already have values. And we don't want to lose those values when processing this action. So when we see this action in action, or this command in action, we're going to see that the default values when we load up the modal are going to be here. So we're already setting the aggregate route ID, excuse me. We have the employee ID. We already have this as a parameter. And all the rest of the information is coming directly from the reporting. So I'm just going to split this and set it as a private member of my action. And I'm going to do similarly, this is just going to be exactly the same as the other form. I'm just going to have my job title so we can have that lookup. Now we can actually use pretty much exactly the same fields here in our add employee. Because they're going to be similar fields, we can have them in here. I'm just going to remove the email because, like I say, we're not going to have this. And I need to split my job titles so that we can use it in our front end page. Perfect. So we have our front end code already. Like I say, we're only going to have 3 because I removed the email. So we're going to have our first name, last name, and job title name. Now these are going to appear already. They're going to be already initialized when we load up the field or when we load up the modal. And I need to return, this one's going to be await just because I've already set it as async. And we're going to process our command, which will be our command. Again, this is all we need to do for our action form. We've already got all the fields. Like I say, it's quite a small one, but let's implement it into the list in the same way. I'm going to have to add my modal. So let's do the same again. We have a private, let's have an action modal component. And this is going to be set employee info. And I'm going to call it set employee modal. Perfect. I'm going to make a similar method here where we show the modal, but this time we have a parameter. So I'm going to have a task and I'm going to call show set employee info modal. But we need our GUID, which will be our employee ID here. And to add these parameters, we need to make sure that we have our modal. So we have our modal here. We want to have our action parameters, which can be a dictionary of a string and an object. So the name of it, and then the actual t value or the actual value that is going to be assigned to the name of it. So we're going to have we're going to add or update. So we add or update the action parameters. Now I'm going to use name of just so it's more specific. It's going to be set employee info, and then we have the name of our parameter here, which will be our employee ID, and then we just want our employee ID. And then similarly, how we do it with our add employee modal, we're going to await our set employee modal, and we're going to show it. If we had more parameters, we would add it this way, but because we only have one, we're going to have it like this. Let's add it to our action list. Actually, no, we don't. We want to add this one to our quick action list. Like I said, this is going to be a specific action for a specific employee. So our action list, like I said, it's going to be more generalized actions. This one is going to be very specific. So let's make a new action definition of this. And then we have a very similar functions or very similar parameters as before. So our action callback, this time it's going to be X that we're using because we want to be using the model here that we created. So we're going to have X, and then we're going to await our show. We want the set employee modal, and then we're going to use our X employee ID here. So that each row that we have is going to use this employee ID specific to that row. Let's add a icon. So our icon is going to be a new action icon. And we can set the properties here. So we'll have our icon. We're just going to set the specific icon now. You can see the different icons that we have, but I want the view. No, I don't, sorry, I want the edit. So I want the action icon, edit, here you go. And we want to see a display. So if we hover over it, we want to know what this action does. So I'm going to put edit here. Perfect. So this is our show employee action modal. I'm also at the same time going to add a view option to this one, because it's we might as well have the option to either click on a name, or we can have like a little icon that we can click on as well, which is a bit more user friendly. It allows the user to go and navigate to a specific page or to that specific employee. So our action callback, this is going to be X, the navigation manager, and we're going to navigate to, and then we have our URL helper here, which we had we did the same before above with our column definition. So we're going to view the employee, and then we want to put the employee ID here because that's our parameter. Let's have this icon as a new action icon, and instead of edit, we want view on this one. And then our display is just going to be a localized string, which is going to be the word view. I'm not sure if these are localized. I don't think I set them to be localized, but we'll see when we launch the application. So if we launch this now, just before we do that, we need to make sure that we add the modal to the page as well. For the view, we don't need to because it's not an action callback, it's just a navigation. But we'll have the employee info here for the modal. So I'm just pasting this across. So it's going to be, instead of edit client, it's just going to be edit employee. And then we can choose whether we want save, whether we want generate, like I say. In this case, I think save is the best fitting word for this action. I'm going to launch my application. As you can see, we need to make sure that we keep the action modal, otherwise it's not going to be able to process the action. And once this builds, well, you should have 2 quick actions in our action list. So let's go on to our timesheet and refresh. You can see we have 2 quick actions here. Our quick action column doesn't appear unless there are actual quick actions to be used. So we have our edit and we have our view. If I were to click on the view, it would navigate. I don't think I have created the view page yet, but if we were to view it, it would navigate to the view page. Let's click on the edit. And instead of Bruce Wayne, let's call them Barry Allen, and I want them now to be a programmer level 3. Let's save that. And if we refresh this, instead of Bruce Wayne, we now have Barry Allen as our programmer level 3. So as you can see from these 2 actions, all I've been required to do is create a component for each that initializes the command and maps the fields to the UI components. So it significantly reduced the complexity and development time associated with building these dynamic and interactive UIs. So it's like an innovative solution that streamlines the process of implementing our command-driven interfaces.